economically. So we have, for several years, I mean, this is the map we have developed in cooperation with Mr. LaRouche, especially after his Abu Dhabi visit. And of course, we have in the World Land Bridge reports we have produced together. And it is also part of what we have proposed for ending the war in Syria, ending the war in Yemen, which is another terrible situation where millions of people are threatened. Even in Syria, millions of people are threatened because of the war situation. And also there's real risk of famine, both in Syria and in Yemen, because of the economic blockade. They are not even allowed to buy food from the international markets or medicine. So in that sense, if we present this new policy, and there is enormous interest from China, Russia, and others to actively work with Iraq, with Iran, with Syria, and the Gulf countries to establish, to turn this region into a workshop. Now, one of the interesting things that happened and then ended up becoming a total disaster is in 2019, the Iraqi prime minister in September 2019 went to China with a huge delegation with ministers, but also most governors from all the different cities in Iraq. And they stayed there for around a week. They visited many places where you have industries, ports, infrastructure, construction sites. And they activated an agreement which was already signed in 2018, but was not active. So the Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi and his delegation, they signed a specific financial appendix to what is called now the Oil for Reconstruction project, which this is a fantastic mechanism for Iraq to take a small fraction of its oil, export it to China, and in return, China and Iraq jointly establish a fund with credits for basically infrastructure projects, where Chinese companies will use that oil money and loans from Chinese banks. And it's very long-term loan agreements, 20 years. So it doesn't cost Iraq so much, but the Chinese companies will start working on rebuilding the Iraqi power production and power grid, building and expanding the railways, the roads, building hospitals, thousands of schools, cleaning the rivers, building irrigation and sewerage systems and ports, airports, all kinds of things. And all could happen at the same time.
Hussein, allow me to ask you, this is the sort of thing that I'm sure has been opposed, possibly. I don't know what's going on in Iraqi politics on this, but these kinds of deals that involve China, where China provides the great majority of the financing, this is something that China is attacked for under the idea that it's deliberately creating a debt for Iraq?
No, in the beginning, there was that kind of propaganda by pro-US, pro-British forces and media in Iraq. But as I will explain soon, this has been removed because there's no truth to this debt trap story. It has never happened in any place on the planet. These are concoctions of the geopolitically minded people who want people to stay away from cooperating with China and the Belt and Road. What Alexander Hamilton did to rebuild the US economy after the revolution. But in this case, Iraq is using its continuous flow of oil, 100,000 barrels of oil, not much more. Iraq exports 4 million barrels of oil every day. So 100,000 barrels could rebuild Iraq's economy over a period of 5 to 10 years. And there's no, the means of extinguishing the debt exist, but also the other lie that people, don't pay attention to is that what China is building, these are not like a port, an airport, railways, hospitals. These are not liabilities. These are assets. So China is providing assets to these nations. It's not a burden to build a factory, a power plant, hospital, school. That's not a burden on that nation. On the contrary, it helps that nation to generate the income, which will allow it to pay back the debt. So the real debt trap was created by the West and the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. And we have many, many studies on that the real debt trap, which nations, and China is helping these nations get out of the debt trap by building a productive economy, which is in any case, what happened when that China-Iraq agreement was reactivated, and it was very clear that the Iraqi government had decided to go all in with this project, working with China, because the situation in Iraq in 2019 was exploding. You had hundreds of thousands of young people on the streets. We have the youth unemployment in Iraq is about 60%. And people get good education, but then there's no employment. There's no productive jobs where they can work. So what happened that as soon as Prime Minister Abdul Mahdi came back from Beijing on September 29th, on October 1st, this protest turned into a really violent colored revolution, where people now were calling for the prime minister to resign because of corruption, because there are lack of services. But the prime minister was in China to change exactly that, to rebuild Iraq's services and give those young people productive jobs. So anyway, third party got in there. There were certain forces who started shooting at both the demonstrators and the police. That triggered a reaction from the police against the demonstrators. And really many young people were killed. And then everybody said the prime minister got to go, including the supreme religious leader told the prime minister that it's time for him to resign. This situation is not repairable. And then you see when the China-Iraq agreement was activated, oil started to flow into the fund, which was created in the Chinese bank. So the accumulation of the money was about to reach $1.5 billion, which is Iraq's 15% share in the 10 billion fund. And when Iraq reached that $1.5 billion in the fund, Iraqi oil money, the Chinese banks will add 85%, which is $8.5 billion. And at that moment, the Iraqi government will present its projects to the Chinese side. The Chinese side will present 3 companies for each single project for Iraq to choose from these companies to work with. That thing happened the first week of January 2020. And guess what happens then? The United States, the President Trump or whoever got him to do that, they assassinated the Iranian Major General Qasem Soleimani and the head of the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Militias, which are now under the Iraqi Defense Ministry. They were assassinated in a drone attack outside the airport of Baghdad. So Qasem Soleimani was actually, as the prime minister, the resigned prime minister said on TV, he said Soleimani was actually on a peace mission, bringing a message back from the Iranian leader about the previous message the prime minister of Iraq had sent or received from Saudi Arabia, because the tension between Saudi Arabia and Iran was very high. And the Iraqi prime minister was mediating. So on his way to meet the Iraqi prime minister, Qasem Soleimani was killed. So what that triggered was attacks on the US embassy by these militias, and that was the nail in the coffin of the Iraqi government. So a new government came in, which completely froze the China-Iraq agreement. They took the money which was in the fund, because that money is Iraqi money. The Iraqi finance ministry has the right to withdraw it anytime. So they took that money, and because the oil prices collapsed in the beginning of the Corona pandemic, so the Iraqi government couldn't even pay salaries to the employees. because if you don't have oil money, you have nothing in Iraq, as I said. So they withdrew the money from that reconstruction fund to pay the salaries of the government employees. And the prime minister, the new prime minister, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, even came out on TV after this thing became explosive, as I will explain, and he even lied and said there is no agreement with China, just a memorandum of understanding. But that was a lie, and then his own ministers later changed that. So the thing is that what we have in Iraq now is really, we are in a very, very decisive moment, because what this new government did also is that they are starting to work intensively with the IMF. They have like a whole month workshop before they presented the last budget last December. It was even published on the website of the IMF that they have had extensive discussions, a workshop for a whole month with the Iraqi finance ministry. And what this government is doing is going along the idea of privatizing almost everything, including the oil, including the Iraqi national banks, and so on and so forth. And the corrupt politicians and their companies and money bags are grabbing these assets. So it's a really, really dire situation in Iraq, and it has to be reversed. And our role has been, I can explain that it's been very, very important in this situation.